Great. So just so folks know, technically we're already broadcasting and on the air. So we're just gonna go ahead and get started. Give me 1 second. Okay. So yeah, so let's get started. Thank you for being on, everyone who's a panelist and everyone who's joining us. Um, I just want to go over a little bit of framing for what we're doing today and introduce the folks who are talking. But basically, for the next hour, part of the start of this conversation is around the DACA decision that happened today. But really, we want to get deeper into how we got to where we're at and what we didn't do and the lessons learned and the things that we should be thinking about as we go forward. Um, so yeah, we have folks who are going to be coming, I think, from different perspectives and from different, I think, pieces of the movement. Honestly, not all of whom got along with each other. So we'll see how that conversation goes. No, but thanks for the drama face, Julio. Um, just to start, the obviously today the Supreme Court decided that the Trump administration did not give a good enough reason to end the deferred action for childhood arrivals program. It's not an outright defense of DACA, but it does confirm that the program can continue to exist. I think for a lot of folks, it's created lots of different feelings. For some of us, a sigh of relief, in terms of like folks who hold DACA, and I think for others has raised like all sorts of feelings, from anger around how undocumented people have been treated in this country, from the fact that DACA has never been enough, that wasn't what we were asking for to begin with, that many of us have been left out, many of our family members have been left out. Um, and that both the Republican and the Democratic Party have used DACA and undocumented people as a tool, often without even getting any of the stuff that we actually need and just like moving their stuff forward. So not an uncontroversial thing. And also just to say that we can't go on without pointing out that this is happening at a moment where around the country, Black people and Black organizers are demanding that police departments be defunded, are demanding a respect for Black lives, in response to police violence, and that we owe a debt to this work historically, to the work that's happening now. And I think to have this conversation very conscious that the Supreme Court decision on DACA should not take away from the anger and the energy that should be continued to be put into defending the lives and defunding police and continuing to fight for our communities. And also like that some people might use this decision for that. So I'll just like acknowledging that piece. But okay, to the conversation. With all of that in mind, we really wanted to recenter the conversation on DACA today in the history of organizing, in the multiple strategies that have been used. And so wanted to introduce you to some of the folks who we brought on today. So just to name people, we asked Lisbeth Mateo, who's an undocumented lawyer and from the law offices of Lisbeth Mateo, and who was part of the group of one of the first undocumented people to do a civil disobedience in the history of this country, and other stuff, but we'll start with that. We have Julio Salgado, who is an artist and cultural leader, and I would say like documented the way that we were organizing and the way we were telling our stories starting like 10, 11 years ago. So we have Julio. Angie Rivera, who's an organizer, a writer. People might know her from her Ask Angie column, as well as No Le Digas a Nadie, the documentary. And so she's joining us here. And also, I know was part of some of the first Coming Out of the Shadows organizing that we did. We have Ray Wences, who's an organizer and Mijente member coming from Chicago, who was also part of some of the first Coming Out of the Shadows and like work against deportations of young people. Now we're with Organized Communities Against Deportations. Almost done here. Nady Dominguez, Mijente strategy advisor and Mijente member, who also had been part of both like some of the legal organizing for civil disobediences and some of the conversations that happened in DC when we like folks were negotiating some of this work. And then last but not least, we have Jackie Mayorga, who might be a little bit newer to this movement, but is coming from South Carolina and was actually getting started in organizing as some of the DACA work was happening. So we brought her into for these conversations. Okay, I'm sure everyone knows everyone's name by now, but let's start with, I kind of have questions for each of you, and mostly because I know some of your history, but if you feel like there's a question that calls to you, please feel free to jump in, keeping in mind the time that we have. But I actually wanted to start with talking about risk and organizing. And I think particularly directing this question to Lisbeth and maybe Ray and Angie. So if you can think back like 10, 11 years ago, when we were starting to think about taking risks, getting arrested, even telling our stories as a tactic. Yeah, tell us like just what you were going through at the time, 10, 11 years ago, and how did you think how did you think of taking risk as part of organizing? Maybe let's start with Lisbeth.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me. 10 years ago, I think it started maybe a little more than 10 years ago. I graduated college in 2008, and I was, even though I didn't recognize it at the time, I was very depressed and I was very angry. And the way that I cope with that anger was by getting busy, by organizing, by doing all kinds of things. And so I think I was so angry that I was willing to take any risks. Of course, I wasn't willing to do it just by myself because I didn't really understand what taking risks meant, how that was going to play out in the larger, immigrant rights movement or the immigrant youth movement. But I remember feeling very uncomfortable when people would say, tell your story, but you don't have to, tell it this way, or you can talk about what you want to do, because I always said that I wanted to be an attorney, but use a different name, or maybe we will blur your face or something like that. And I just felt very incomplete, very empty when I did that. And so at some point I was like, no, I just want to say, my full name. Like, don't make up a name for me. Like, I just want to say who I am. I want people to know, because it's also going to help me just feel better about myself and feel better about my situation. But I always had that sort of little voice in the back of my head that kept telling me, don't take too many risks. Don't be too open about your status. Think about your parents. Think about your family. What are you doing? This is not the right thing to do. So I always had those concerns. But I think I was hopeful that things would change. And then more like 10 years ago, I met a group of organizers, Tania included, that I think I don't know if they were angry. I don't know at what point they were in their lives, but I think we clicked so much that we realized the only way to actually move forward, the only way that we're going to be able to not only take lead of our quote unquote movement, but that we were going to be able to achieve anything, to actually win something for our communities, was if we took greater risks, if we were the ones leading our movement, leading the organizations, sitting down with congressional officers, with politicians, and dictating what we wanted from them, right? And so the way that we thought we could do that was by actually putting ourselves, our bodies, our futures on the line. And I was very willing to do it because in my mind, I had nothing to lose. In my mind, the dream either passes in 2010 or I'm leaving this country, because I'm not going to stay here. I'm not going to be able to go to law school. I'm not going to be able to do everything that I want to do in life. I think I was very naive, obviously, but that was my thinking. It was, I think, out of desperation, but also calculated risk. I don't think we were just, naive kids. We actually did a lot of analysis and strategizing before we took greater risks, like getting arrested or doing civil disobedience actions, things like that. So I think that's where I was 10 years ago.
Can I add? Yeah, thank you, Elizabeth. Yes, I echo a lot of the feelings. Myself, being undocumented at the time, I was also going through a lot of depression and confusion and frustration. I think one of the things that I would like to add in terms of like taking risk is that for me personally, being also a queer person, and having gone through the process of coming out of the shadows, and feeling supported by some of the my community at the time, on that end, and also I think 10 years ago I was starting to get politicized. I was watching Harvey Milk videos. I was like learning about Marsha P. Johnson, and to me, like coming out was a risk, and like we even here in Chicago talked about it as like every time that we would start a meeting and share our names, and we would say like, and I'm undocumented, like that felt like a real strong political statement to make because we had been invisibilized for so long. And then also a continuation of lifting up that yes, many of us are also part of the queer community, and there's a history of resistance around there, and also knowing the risks that many people before us have taken, whether by speaking out, by putting their bodies on the line. That was really inspirational for me. And so in this moment, I'm hopeful that whatever work we were able to lay, whether we made mistakes or not, is actually has been an inspiration for many people that are still organizing around DACA and stopping deportations.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me, and I'm so honored to be here with you all. So 10 years ago, I was trying to host our first Coming Out of the Shadows event in New York City. Everybody was really afraid to come. It must have been maybe like 15 of us just standing there with our signs. And even that was like big, right? Like I remember my hands were shaking, and I remember like having to share my story like 5 times because we didn't have enough people to go and take up the time. And I remember also feeling really angry and just feeling like if I'm gonna live my life being afraid and being angry, then I might as well do something about it. And it was mostly looking up to you all also as inspiration and also motivation, and feeling like there are people in my community. When I was undocumented and in high school, I didn't really have an undocumented community. I didn't have friends that were undocumented, and it was mostly being part of this network and meeting you all in national spaces that inspired us to do this kind of work in New York City. And then this idea of, I came into the movement feeling like if we just get papers, right, that will fix all the issues because it would allow us to work and go to school and live the things that we wanted to live. And it was mostly by building with Black Americans in my community that challenged me on that notion, and politicized me even further because I felt like as a young person, all my issues would just be fixed if I just got papers, right? And so I just really want to appreciate that work and the organizing that was happening here in New York City against police brutality, against defunding the NYPD. That really just pushed us and pushed me personally to see my life and my, organizing beyond just citizenship work. But definitely 10 years ago, my own risk assessment, I wasn't as brave as Lisbeth to get arrested, but I was definitely wanting to figure out what are ways that I can still show up in other ways to support that work. And then now, like, I work with mostly undocumented high school students who did not qualify for DACA, right? And so it's interesting to see, the ways we educate the folks that are coming in and make space for them to lead, and also their energy and their perspective is so different, and still so valuable in how we move forward, and the way that they see solidarity and organizing in DACA too.
Thank you, Angie. And I think hopefully we'll get a little bit more time too to talk through how some of our perspectives have changed. I know I started with like where were we 10 years ago, but you started us with that combo, so thank you. I want to bring in Julio into these piece before we move on to the next part. You know, you weren't getting arrested, but you were documenting all of the actions through your art. You were putting out our stories by like drawing people who were coming out of the shadows. And like I remember a couple of quotes and things like that that really like visibilized the movement. And then I think we were also just like creating a lot of culture that gave us life in the middle of these civil disobediences. I remember songs, I remember plays, which to me like also has its level of risk and of like contributing to the narrative. So I just want to like ask you, like what were you thinking at the time, and like when you were creating this art, how were you seeing the movement? Yeah, and like what impact do you think it had?
Thank you for having me too. I'm really excited to be, in conversation with all of y'all who, I've known for a long time. And yeah, I mean, 10 years ago, I graduated from college. 2010 was super, it was one of those, it was a very turning point for a lot of us. I graduated high school in 2001. So it took me like 9 years to get that degree, right? And not just undocumented people, but just like first generation college students. It's just like, it was a struggle. Being undocumented on top of that was just like, ¿por qué? But, I remember graduating, like having this degree and then all of a sudden I turn to Facebook and I see, Tania, Lisbeth and Mo and Yahaira and Raul, it's just, I'm like, what the hell are they doing? What, like the thing that we had been avoiding, the thing that we had been told not to do. Lisbeth mentioned it, like people using our parents to be like at a local level, whenever you were sharing your stories, I had people tell me like, why are you being selfish? Why are you thinking about your parents? Like people can follow, like you became very paranoid. And so seeing, you all do that, it really was a turning point for me. And up to that point, drawing and, I have a degree in journalism. That's what I was doing in college. I knew the importance of documenting what was happening because the media was still calling us, illegals. They were still, I felt like they weren't getting it right. And they were like, how dare you make people angry? When 2010 and all the other, civil disobediences were happening, people were like, you're getting people angry. You're not getting people on your side. And so I felt that they weren't getting that point. And so, as mentioned, I came in as like, I'm like, I need to document this. I need to make sure that people know. And as Ray mentioned, in highlighting the fact that the majority of people that, the 5 people that were sitting down in McCain's office were identified as queer. I'm like, that was a huge thing. And I wanted people not to forget that. And so I'm like, I'm gonna draw and I'm gonna draw this and, make sure people don't remember and very, inspire. I felt that, Black Americans have definitely created a blueprint for us. Emory Douglas, who created a lot of work for the Black Panthers, I was super, super inspired by that. And, reminding people like who was here, doing the work.
Thank you. So going to try to go forward / bring in a little bit of context, but just in terms of telling the story, we haven't mentioned that some of the deportation defense work to like stop the deportation of young people really started in like 2009-ish, from what I remember. We had the case in Chicago that like formed the Immigrant Youth Justice League that Reina and I come out of. We had like nationally the cases that were being run by Dream activists, the END cases, education not deportation as we used to call them, and that really like for a lot of us was part of what Lisbeth was mentioning of determining risk, right? Like I remember when we were starting to think about civil disobedience and coming out of the shadows, it was sort of like, well, we've been able to stop the deportations of other people in the past. Like maybe we can stop our own deportations too if it happens and if it gets to that. And so you see how like some of this work was building on itself from the deportation defense to the coming out of the shadows to the civil disobediences. So the END cases were happening in 2009. The first coming out of the shadows was in 2010, followed by the first civil disobedience by undocumented people in 2010. The DREAM Act, which was the policy that we were fighting for at the time, that for us was like something that legalized people but didn't come with enforcement, right? In terms of like what we were trying to do. Failed several times in 2010, in 2011. And then in 2012, Obama announces DACA, right? And some of it comes from the DREAM Act work that we did. And some of it also comes from the deportation defense work that we did, because it was really about some of that. I know lots of people may have lots of stuff to say about this, but I actually want to bring in Nady and Jackie with two different perspectives. Nady, you were involved in a lot of this stuff, but really want to ask you about the stuff that was happening in DC, and like what were the negotiations and the conversations that were happening in DC, and how did organizing play a part of those negotiations?
Yeah, I mean, I think just for quick context for folks, you know, that maybe don't know the story. And first of all, it's so good to see all of you. And like, we look way adults now. We're definitely, time is real. And so it's really good to see you all. I think for context, like folks really that don't know the story should really know that like the one quote unquote negotiation meeting that happened in May, and then the announcement came less than a month after. And so that should just like quickly give people perspective of how it wasn't necessarily those negotiations at all that made it possible, but it was everything else that had happened before. And you know, after the failed, the failed Congress failed us to actually have a solution in 2010. I think many of us across the country, but I remember, Lisbeth, we met at the Maldiv building with all of the people that had been throwing down for several months at that point, organizing, and we were all very sad and very just kind of like, what happens next, and like, we just can't keep on trying the same things again and again and again. Like, we've tried everything, and this time people risk their lives of being deported. And it was really through those conversations that the idea of, well, we've tried the legislative way, yeah, the judiciary way is going to take very long, but it's being tried by the deportation cases, by the cases that other folks were already doing. What's the other branch of government that we could use to put pressure? And through many different strategy conversations, it was very clear that the one place we hadn't really like utilized or like used as leverage was the executive branch. And so through organizing, there was a whole campaign, the Right to Dream campaign, that was basically all about using executive power to get the president to stop the deportations of immigrant and undocumented youth and provide some sort of lawful status that included a work permit. I think you've heard like already from our folks here that like a big theme when we would talk about like what was important for folks was like people were getting these degrees and were very depressed and didn't know whether or not they were going to be able to do anything with them, or even if they were not going to school, if they're going to go to work, being really worried about like their future, right? Like, and so I think the piece around work permits was like a real thing in those conversations. And so in 2011, we like launched a public campaign around that specific demand. And by May of, there were several things. I remember there was like the big New York Times article that was like, this is possible, the president is lying, to leak memos of inside the administration basically saying that they could have done this a long time ago and chose not to do it. This is the Obama administration. So there were so many different things, but always backed by like actual grassroots organizing. And so in May of 2012, several folks like, Gaby Pacheco, Eric Andiola, myself, were basically like, we were asked to meet with the White House lawyers. And back then, I was still undocumented and all of us were, so we couldn't even meet with them inside the White House. We had to meet with them on a row house on the side of the Lafayette Park in DC. That was the very first time for me of ever coming to DC. And basically they went into that meeting and they didn't really want to have a conversation. What they said to us was basically, this is not possible, it's not legal. We just want you guys to know that we're trying everything we can, but this is not possible. But because of the organizing that had been taking place, we had both legal memos, we have the lawyers behind it, we had our organizing behind it. And so we did two things. We like right before had delivered a letter of 100 plus more immigration professors, law professors, that basically said this is totally possible and constitutionally possible, and did that public letter. And also we knew that they were going to pretend like this never happened. So while we were meeting with them, we told them we gave La Opinion the exclusive of this meeting. So the whole country is going to know that this meeting is taking place in case you ever take it back. And then we told them, you have a month to give us an answer. And if you don't, at this point, there was so much in motion that we knew a lot of folks were going to take action. And it was re-election year for Obama. And it took less than a month, 2 weeks after, NIA folks and others took over Obama offices. And a lot of this wasn't even coordinated. It was like organically the moment. It wasn't like we were calling up each other. I think there were so many different sectors of the movement. And the White House called when those sit-ins started to happen in those Obama offices. And they basically said, you guys said we had a month. Can you stop them? And we said, we're like, it sounds like you're running out of time. So you got to do something. And like, people are going to do whatever they're going to do. This is your problem, not our problem. And less than a week later, we got the Rose Garden announcement. And so I think that was all possible because of organizing. Nothing less than that, It was only because of the organizing that had been done for so many years before then.
I want to bring in Jacqueline, and you were at this point graduating high school, starting to in South Carolina, also like a place where maybe some of these civil disobediences weren't happening yet. But tell us about just like what that was like for you to enter the movement as DACA was moving forward, and some of the local life in South Carolina.
All right. So first I want to say thank you. Thank you for all the work that everybody has done. It's extremely humbling, and also I'm learning a lot from you guys as you guys speak. Like a lot of the stuff I knew it was all things to organizing, but it's nice to see. I've recognized some of you guys from social media, but it's nice to finally kind of see you. I know it's virtual, but just really grateful for everything you guys done. In 2010, I actually remember that day when the DREAM Act was actually up for vote, and I was in 10th grade, and I was working at a Mexican restaurant, and it came about 2 months after I had applied at an ice cream shop for a job. And I remember they had accepted me, and I thought I was just going to be okay. Like, they weren't going to ask me for a social. And so they asked me for a social, and I was just very upset. And then I had found this job at a Mexican restaurant as a waitress. And I remember having the news, the TV on, and having all the news, just basically everything was live, showing a lot of you guys also advocating, organizing the sit-ins, the civil disobedience. And I always just remember looking up to you all. Then 2012 happened, and this came also right when I graduated high school, and I was kind of like in limbo, like what's going to happen? What's next for me? Kind of just processing how my life was going to change. And then I got this good news, and I felt like I was also I didn't go through depression. I knew I was feeling anxious and uneasy and just uncertain of everything. But it was very inspiring to see everybody, what everybody was doing. I was just, I don't know. It opened so many doors and opportunities. And then when I started college, I met other people who were also undocumented, and I met my best friends, and we started organizing on campus. We started raising awareness about immigrant issues. And I went to a small liberal arts college in Columbia, South Carolina, called Columbia College. And it was an all-women school until last year, where they're now accepting men. But really, we just were raising awareness on the issue, advocating for more. And then we partnered up also with Latin American Coalition in Charlotte, North Carolina, and they started training us and organizing and, demanding immigration for all. and that's kind of where I got started a little bit with organizing. But it was just a lot of the times I would be very upset and frustrated because it was so hard to organize in the South. It was so hard to like talk to politicians who were like just flat out racist. Like they weren't shy about it. So the fight continues, and South Carolina still has not passed any type of legislation for DREAM Act. Like we still aren't able to get professional licenses. We are still not able to receive in-state tuition. So there's definitely work to be done.
Thank you. And so that actually moves me to the next part, which I think is like, maybe it's like all the stuff that still has to be done / the things that we didn't get done piece in some of this. I think, so thank you for getting us started on that. And I want to go back to Ray and Angie and then bring in Lisbeth a little bit. Sorry, there's like noise happening here in the background. But I think, one of the things that I remember really clearly was that after the DREAM Act failed, after DACA had passed, a lot of us continued to organize, but went into like a slightly different focus areas, right? We weren't fighting for DACA anymore. We weren't fighting for the DREAM Act. I remember Chicago really turned to deportation defense. I remember New York folks really turned into state New York DREAM Act work. So I wanted to bring you two to just tell us a little bit about how some of our work shift once DACA had passed and once DREAM Act had failed.
Yeah. So thank you. When here in Chicago, when DACA happened, I remember the day that the announcement came down. It was June 15, 2012. So it was my birthday, and I was working at a factory somewhere because I was like, I need to work. And I think that week, or the next week, we were actually, Chicago was set to be the next city that was going to do a sit-in at an Obama office. So then it was like, great, DACA, we won, no sit-in. And then that also gave us the opportunity to breathe, I think, like take a little break and just be kind of celebrate the victory, while at the same time, I think for me personally, it opened up the space to think about like the possibilities of what could happen now that like this victory was there. And I mean, we knew that things like 287G programs were getting expanded. Secure communities was also, we had, I think it was 2011, right, when there were this task force that was trying to implement secure communities at a federal level. And so as back then, the Immigrant Youth Justice League, we really started also diving more into supporting people that were getting left out. And I think part of like left out of either DACA or that were being hyper criminalized by all these other programs. And that's kind of been like the intervention that here now Organized Communities Against Deportation continues to make at the local level, which is really for us one immediate threat to all of our communities, non-citizens, right, is deportation, and even more under this administration. And so the work of, we went from doing some of the like federal policy, trying to push for a DREAM Act or like federal legislation, to really like honing in into like what is the mechanism that is actually taking people away from our communities, and how can we prevent that from happening.
So here in New York, I guess, so the DREAM Act fails in 2010, and I guess it would be important for me to mention that we left all national spaces as an organization because of all the things that went down, from missing strategies to just like flat out violence, and we just didn't feel safe as a group in national spaces anymore. And so we redirected all of our energy into state work, which meant building out like our own state campaigns. Our organization had been created to advocate for the federal DREAM Act, and so that had been like our campaign. Every time we fundraise money, it was for that. Every time we went to DC, it was for that. And so now we had to dive into state politics and build out a state campaign and what that looked like. New York is not as progressive as people think. And so it took us close to 10 years to pass our state DREAM Act. After many compromises, right? The thing that ended up passing was just TAP, or our state aid for education. our initial bill before DACA had been implemented had all things from healthcare to working papers, TAP assistance, and driver's licenses, which at the time was like radical for us because New York, unfortunately, Islamophobia is still a thing here. And so 9/11 is always used against immigrant efforts, and it's always the tool that people weaponize here against any kind of legislation that would impact immigrants. And so there's, you know, a lot of like Islamophobia that is used against issues that would impact immigrants, especially a push for driver's licenses. And so for many years, what we did was a state campaign around the New York Dream Act, and then also balancing that with political education and solidarity-based organizing around other issues. Most of the membership and youth that were coming into our work at the time was mixed. So folks that had DACA and felt a little bit more safe and empowered to be involved, folks that got DACA and wanted to live their lives stepped down, and then we had a lot of new people who saw the power in community organizing and wanted to get involved. And so we've been balancing the, like Ray said, the mixture of folks that were left out while also like folks that were applying for DACA, right? We were supporting them through legal clinics and some deportation defense work that is not, there's like very little capacity in that, and a lot of our folks burnt out really quickly when it came to deportation defense work, which is also something that I wanted to talk about. We did stop several deportation campaigns as an organization, and it's just, you know, it is really hard on organizers to respond to raids at 4 in the morning and calls from detention centers at 5 a.m. and the toll that it takes financially as well as an organization. It was really hard to maintain the momentum. And I think we lost one deportation case, and it just really impacted everybody's well-being, and it became, you know, really hard to sustain. So we took a stop from deportation defense for like folks' well-being, which feels a little bit selfish to say out loud, but also something that I want to recognize that we decided as a team. And so, yeah, building out the state campaign and working with a lot of school-based organizing, like Jackie mentioned, we started developing dream teams in schools and building out relationships with educators and lawyers, which was new for us because all of our energy had been put to federal use. And we recently won the New York Dream Act about 2 years ago, and we're still dealing with the impacts of that, you know, very little implementation strategies. And the governor, as you all have seen, like, is not, you know, meeting the needs of the community. And so there's just been a lot of organizing around that.
Thank you. I want to go to Lisbeth again, because Lisbeth, you didn't do that. You didn't focus on local stuff. Well, maybe you did, but you definitely stayed within the national, federal deportation defense conversations and trying to push that. So can you, let's spend a little bit of time, I would say, talking about the Bring Them Home campaign to start, as another tactic that I think really pushed things forward, and just, your work following your work nationally and federally, thinking about the times after the Dream Act failed.
Sure. So, I mean, right after the Dream Act failed, I think it was very clear, at least to some of us, that we needed to keep pushing, that we needed to take bolder actions. We were always trying to figure out what is the next thing we can do to push the envelope. We can't stay in the same sort of, with the same tactics. Like, obviously what we were doing like wasn't enough, it didn't work. So we're always trying to challenge the status quo in whatever ways we could. So we organize a lot in other areas. So I don't know that I would call my work national. We're definitely working with local communities. So we're connecting with undocumented organizers. Some of them were like high school students out of like Atlanta and Georgia that were super like smart and strategic and just so inspiring. And so we work with them. We work with like different organizations all over the country. It wasn't I wouldn't call myself like a national organizer. And most of my work was actually doing a lot of policy work. So I was the one communicating with elected officials. We were still doing a lot of deportation defense, but always working with local communities, and essentially created this program eventually that we call Save Your Own Community, that had several components, from organizing locally, helping people set up vigils or protests or rallies in front of like detention centers or at a church or different places, working with the media, working with attorneys, and then working with elected officials, trying to get them to, not only intervene when a dreamer was getting deported, but actually intervene when someone with maybe a criminal conviction or someone who did not fit the dreamer or the dreamer narrative was getting deported. So right after DACA was announced, NIA was the one that organized the different sit-ins, and I was a part of NIA, the National Immigrant Youth Alliance, which doesn't exist anymore, but the group organized the sit-ins in Obama's offices, and then as soon as DACA was announced, they took off and went to Florida. And so in Florida, a couple of organizers, one from New York and another one from North Carolina, Marcos and Bidi, infiltrated a detention center in Broward, where we were actually getting a lot of calls from families who were telling us, we have family members who have been detained for 11 months, for 2 years, like some ridiculous amount of time. There were a lot of human rights violations that were taking place, very horrible things taking place in detention centers. And so these two organizers, undocumented organizers, decided to get arrested, get detained by ICE, and infiltrate the detention center to then organize from inside. So that was sort of like our next escalation. But it was in response to what the community was telling us. The community telling us, like, this is going on. And then we trying to figure out how do we bring attention to that. And always, again, trying to push the envelope, right? So that happened. Then another infiltration happened in Detroit, Michigan. But right after DACA was announced, which I think is very important, is that we received calls, we received messages from undocumented or formerly undocumented people living in Mexico, living in other countries, who after the DREAM Act failed, essentially felt like there was no point in staying in the U.S. and left the country, went back to their country of birth, thinking that they could go to college there, thinking that they could have a better life, maybe a brighter future, and then realizing it wasn't the case. And then as soon as DACA was announced, they were wondering, can I come back? Is this program going to benefit me? So as people were talking about, working with a lot of folks who were left out of the program. So not only were some folks here in the US left out of the program, but those who grew up in the US and were forced to leave by their circumstances, or were removed, or for whatever reason were not in the US but had grown up here, wanted to come back and wanted to apply for DACA. And for several months we were telling them, there's nothing we can do, like, you can't apply for this program, you don't qualify, there's nothing we can do. But always in the back of our minds, we had this question of, what can we do to bring them back? And I don't know if, Tania, you will agree with me, but I think some of the civil disobedience actions that we did, it kind of started like a joke, like just sort of thinking, maybe we can do this, not really that we could actually do it. And then the more curious we got, the more we sort of started really taking things seriously and talking strategy and trying to figure out, how do we make this happen? And so at some point, I think we realized the only way we're going to be able to bring back these individuals, these dreamers, quote unquote dreamers, is if some of us leave. And personally, I mean, I was at a point in my life where I was, again, angry. I had been working on deportation defense for several years, and we won many cases, but we also lost a lot of cases. And I agree with Angie, that takes a toll on you. Like, it really does. and it makes you angry. It makes you want to, at least for me, it made me want to work harder. It made me want to win even more. And so I think that's why I made a decision to leave the US. About a month and a half before I started law school, I had already been accepted into law school, and I was so sure that my next move in life was gonna go to law school, become an attorney. But I wanted to make one last push. I wanted to do one last effort to hopefully change the way that we organize, and hopefully change the direction in which, or not even the direction, but just the things that we thought could be possible as undocumented people, the things that we can make happen, right? And I think I had a lot of faith in our community. Like, I seriously had a lot of faith, because I put my life, my future, my career, my future career on the line to do that. But I didn't do it because I thought I could, you know, on my own come back, or that I had like superpowers to do that. No, I did it because I knew that our community, our movement was ready to take on that challenge. And so that's how it happened. And, you know, I left and spent about 13 days in Mexico, and then came back. 2 other organizers from NIA joined me a few days after that. And then we came back in July, I think July 23rd, 2013, with 6 other 4 million documented young people. And we saw entry at the border in Nogales, Mexico. And we were detained. We spent 70 days in detention. We organized in detention to essentially, you know, be able to stay. And eventually, after 17 days, we were released. And that's what became known as the Dream 9, or the Bring Them Home campaign. And I think the goal was to continue doing that as many times as possible, and to also highlight the crisis that was already happening at the border, right? A lot of people seeking asylum and being turned away. So yeah, that's what the Bring Them Home campaign was.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm trying to move because this noise at the same time. But so with the 10 minutes that we have left, I just I don't know if people would agree, but the way that I see sort of the trajectory of our movement is that a lot of us started with coming in with like a very personal anger, frustration, like lack of opportunity, and joined this movement that was trying to get the Dream Act, was trying to be undocumented and unafraid. Ended up like moving towards deportation defense, and I think not just of young people, but then like ended up not just our parents, but like adults, people who had criminal records, and started fighting and pushing that way. So I think like I've seen our movement sort of evolve in different ways in this particular branch of it, working on state issues, working on 287G, working on federal issues, pushing the levels of risk, right? Like I think like Lisbeth, to what you were saying, like to me, like the first coming out of the shadows felt scary when we were doing it. And then when we had done it and figured it out, like, it's like, what's next? And then we did the civil disobedience, and the first civil disobedience felt like we didn't know what was going to happen. And then we figured those out, and then it was like, what's next? And so I think it's almost this like, we were testing things out and escalating risk, and moving our targets and figuring out how to get more done, even as undocumented people with so many barriers. I think the last thing I'll say, and then I'm gonna ask y'all for conclusions a little bit, but I think there was the failure of the Dream Act in some ways, maybe with the combination of DACA, seems to me like it opened up a lot of possibilities for organizing for a lot of us. You know, we talked about the deportation defense work, the state Dream Act, the 287G. Julio, I don't know that I'll have time to do it, but I was gonna ask you about the undocuqueer movement, and how like a lot of us who hadn't been talking about being queer after the Dream Act failed and DACA was being pushed forward, we were like, oh yeah, and by the way, we're gay. You kept telling me not to say that because of the whole like DOMA and like defense of like marriage act stuff, but guess what, I am. So it's complicated. Anyway, so I'll pass it to Julio first, but I really wanted to just ask folks for conclusions. Like, you know, there's a lot of folks who are coming into the movement, maybe even now, who are thinking like, what happens next? So I just wanted to give a chance to each person to just give your last thoughts, lessons learned, tips for the future as we're closing. So we'll start with Julio.
Yeah, I think it was hella gay. I think if anything, I think one of the things that happened after 2010, from a from a cultural perspective, right? Like the way that we were approaching the conversation started to shift. Well, some people started to shift where it wasn't just about the youths anymore, right? Like it was like because if a lot of the narratives before this, the narratives that we knew was like it wasn't my fault, it was my parents' fault. They're the one who brought me here. I'm a good American, like those words that that really inform what DACA ended up being as well. Who benefited from it, who got criminalized for it, and all those things. And so, as a creative, as an artist, I wanted to make sure that one point that Angie touched to as well is like the way that we were feeling tired, and I found through art and through making videos, we started making the undocumented and awkward videos just because I knew a lot of people, in the movement were hella funny, and we were dealing this with a lot of humor. And I really, the work that Tam Tran, who's no longer here with us, as a filmmaker, as the way that she was behind the camera and creating work, I really wanted to continue to do that work because we were being asked to do interviews by people who were not really understanding us, and they saw us as subjects, and I didn't want to be a subject anymore. I wanted to hold the camera. I wanted to put myself and own my story, because I was like, they didn't do all this work. People didn't get arrested for some other people to all of a sudden getting credit or should be creative. Like, I want to be creative. I'm a creative person. And so I think a lot of that shifted to that empowerment of I hate that word empowerment, but this is what it was. It was empowerment. It really changed the narrative using humor, because this system was getting us tired, but we were people. We're complex people. We're people we're queer. We like to party. We like to do all this stuff that it wasn't being portrayed. And so I will leave it with with this is like this is one part of us, but there's more to us than than this. And I think that continuing to focus on the different aspects of us as undocumented people, as queer people, it's important to highlight that. And so I want to continue doing that work as an artist and that creative.
Thank you, Julio. Who wants to go next? Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think I want to make sure that we have very little time, so I'm gonna go bullet points. I think it's super important not to forget to name how already folded in a lot of us were into the Now One More campaign, and really fighting white supremacist laws and anti-immigrant laws like SB 1070 and the Alabama laws. There's no coincidence. Like, nobody should ever wonder why or how did we go from DACA to DAPA. It was always very clear for us from the very beginning that even the DREAM Act, even DACA was not the end goal. It was a step forward of trying to make way for more things. And so we quickly pivoted. I remember the next day we were like, well, they don't want us to say this publicly, but if you could stop our deportations, why can't you stop the deportations of other people, right? And they literally, when I mean they, the White House didn't want us to say that out loud, right? That was one of their worst nightmares. And then we want DAPA too, right? And so I think it's important just to make those correlations, because we marched in Arizona against SB 1070. We did national actions for the Now One More campaign. And I think it was all part of the evolution of where I see ourselves now in this moment. I wanted to I think for me in this moment of watching for a whole month uprisings led by super powerful Black young people in this moment, I think it's important to also name, I think, our own evolution into really recognizing the intersections between race, class, and sexuality. And the more and more I see many folks becoming more and more abolitionists and anti-imperialist and anti-capitalist, because we've learned through our own trajectory. I'll speak for myself. I've learned through my own trajectory that we could have a work permit, but that's not going to change much if we don't actually keep on fighting back the systems that keep our people oppressed, right? And I think the coronavirus and all the last few months have really shown all of us how basically all of our communities of color, poor people, are just basically interchangeable, and that our lives are not really valued. And so I think in this moment, more and more, I see so many young folks moving our movement towards actually being very clear who's the enemy, and that we shouldn't really have enforcement, period. That ICE was a made up thing, that police departments shouldn't have that much fucking money, and that we really don't need them in our community. And where should that money go to? Is like a real pivot, I think, for us in this moment. So I think the lessons learned for me, I am ready not to be I haven't been leading any of this work for a really long time. I went into the labor rights organizing and other organizing. So it's really awesome to see this moment of people kind of connecting the dots, but really, really want to kind of welcome people that are watching right now, the people that today are feeling a little bit relief, because we're happy for you, that you feel a little relief that you don't have to worry about losing your work permit. And I invite you to think about what you can do now to make sure that a lot of us are safe, right? And that's the next step, because you have a role to play in this movement to continue to fight back all these systems that keep our people down. So welcome, and this is your space. And whatever I can do to support young folks leading, that's what people did to us, and look where we are. So we just need to do it better next time and do more of it.
Thank you. And yeah, for all the panelists, if y'all can stay a couple minutes just to say our final say, please do so. Ray, Lisbeth, Jacqueline, or Angie.
I can go. Again, thank you for the invitation. I just wanted to, lift up, and this is something that happened here last week, was that, as you all know, Organized Communities Against Deportations continues to do work against deportations in the Chicagoland area. Last week, some of you may have heard, one of our members was deported almost in the span of less than 24 hours. He had DACA in the past, was detained, won his release from detention after 9 months of organizing, and we were just waiting for his DACA to get adjudicated or approved, but unfortunately he was redetained during an ICE check-in and deported. And so I just want to lift up two things. One, that the work continues, that the work against deportations is still ongoing, and that at least from what I have seen, under this administration, no status is that makes actually anyone safe from deportation, right? Like we have legal permanent residents, people with TPS, with other statuses that have been at risk of deportation or already deported. And so I want to lift up the importance of continuing to hold both agencies accountable for the wrongdoings, for their actions, but also continue to push elected officials to do more than just the statement about how they support DACA and how they're going to continue to fight for people with DACA and the others. But really what we need is for them to be making calls to ICE, for them to be showing up with people at ICE check-ins, for them to be bolder, because our movement is being bolder. And I feel like they're not there yet. So continuing to push. And I think the other thing that I also wanted to lift up is the ongoing work that's also happening across, like on the other side, right? Lift up Otros Dreams en Acción, Deportados Unidos, and other organizations that actually are also responding to that crisis of people when they get deported or decide to go back to their countries. There is organizing happening. So this isn't just some US phenomenon that's happening. It's actually a transnational movement. And so recognizing that and continuing to make those connections, I think is going to be really important if we want our movement to continue thriving in the future. Thank you.
I totally agree with what you were saying, Ray. I think for me, two things. I really appreciate that the immigrant rights movement is starting to look at white supremacy as like an issue, right? I feel like for the longest time, we were trying to assimilate into white supremacy, benefit from white supremacy, right? And all these things. Um, and so even just like, I'm looking forward to diving into that more and seeing how we can challenge that and organize around that, and even having like more diverse panelists, and things like that that can challenge some of these things, for sure, is one thing. And I think another thing that I want to see our movement get to is to not just see like Black people in our community as the inspiration, but also as like allies and people that we show up for and we protect and we care for, and that we're allies for each other. That's where I want our spaces to get to, as immigrant folks, right? And not to just see like the movements to be parallel, but to see how we're here to defend and protect each other from white supremacy, and just like do what it takes for us to get there.
My next. So I think two things for me. I want to echo what Ray mentioned, and all the things that you said really resonate with me, because I've I'm not organizing as much anymore. I'm an attorney, so representing my clients takes up a lot of my time. But I have been working with a group of mostly women, mostly asylum seekers who have been living in sanctuary, have been living in churches for years, some of them, and we've been trying to work really hard to stop their deportations. And what we keep hearing, not just everyone, even our immigrant rights movement, is that they're just not priorities. And elected officials have actually told us to their faces, have said, you're not children dying at the border. You're just not a priority right now. And so I hope that our immigrant youth movement could actually look at what's happening in other areas as well, because this is the future of our community if we're not careful. The reason these women are living in sanctuary is because they lost their cases, their deportation cases, and the only thing that has kept them safe and with their families is actually living in a church, which is not life for them. I mean, it's very difficult. So I just wanted to say that, because I think that there's a lot of work that's happening that we can be linking up with in the immigrant rights movement. Plus everything else that Angie said, with standing in solidarity and working as shoulder to shoulder with Black immigrants, Black Lives Matter movement. And then the other thing that I want to say, which I don't know if I mentioned, but like, I'm not a DACA recipient. I am fully undocumented. I technically qualify for DACA, but the Obama administration denied me DACA in 8 days before Trump took over. And I just want to make sure that young people who are listening, who don't have DACA right now, who may not qualify for DACA, even if new applications start getting accepted by USCIS, don't give up. Get involved in your community. Like, you can keep yourself and your family safe if you organize. That's how I've been able to survive. And so if you have any questions, if I could give you any information, anything that you need, just connect with me. I want to make sure that people who are not DACA recipients, who are not impacted by this decision, don't feel left out. So yeah, that's all I wanted to say.
Last but not least, Jackie.
Just want to say thank you again for having me. Everything that everybody has said really resonates with me. As a DACA recipient, it's important to reaffirm that Black Lives Matter, and that the Black Lives Matter movement, I mean, immigration is a Black Lives Matter movement issue also, and Black immigrants are actually disproportionately affected by the cruel immigration system and policies. We really we can't settle for crumbs, we deserve more, there has to be more. Currently, I'm a graduate student at Boston College School of Social Work, so I'm getting my master's in social work, and my concentrations is in a macro concentration in Latinx communities. So the work starts, and I'm fueled, and I'm thankful for the opportunity to listen to these amazing and just chingones organizers. Like, you guys are so awesome and badass. La lucha sigue. So thank you.
Thank you. And so thank you again to Julio Salgado, Jacqueline Mayorga, Nady Dominguez, Lisbeth Mateo, Ray Wences, and Angie Rivera for joining us. There's so many things that we didn't get into, including like the people who got denied DACA for organizing that Lisbeth mentioned at the end. My sister Nadia Unzueta was also one of those folks. And I think there's I think the message that we really wanted to get out today is that this wasn't given to us. This didn't happen in a vacuum. People organized in multiple ways to try to change people's minds, to stop deportations. And something that's been said both by panelists and I think by the people who are listening to us here is that we owe a lot to other social movements, in particular the movement for Black Lives, the things that are happening right now in terms of the uprisings. And I remember when we were coming out, we were also talking about the gay liberation movement, the immigrant rights movement of 2006 that started to push back against some of those bad policies. And so I think for people who are listening us to it right now, part of our message is really like organizing works. Organizing in multiple strategies has been the way that we've been able to change things and shift things. And you know, the Supreme Court decision today is something to like celebrate and enjoy, and at the same time, it's just one more building block of the work that we've been doing for such a long time. So with that, I just wanted to thank all the panelists, everyone who's listening to us. Again, my name is Tania Unzueta. I'm the political director for Mijente. And if you want more information on us, please visit Mijente, MIJENT.net for more info. So thank you, everyone.